Why are those of us born between 1965 and 1980 called Gen X? I'm going to tell you at the end of this video exactly why, but before I do that, let me tell you 3 things that we were called before they called us Gen X, that if Gen X hadn't come around as a term, they might still be calling us that. The first was the latchkey generation, or latchkey kids. They noticed that when we were small, that half of our parents were getting divorced, and the ones that weren't, both of them typically had jobs. So we would go off to school in our school bus with our house key around our neck, and we'd come home and no one would be there. So we'd let ourselves in, we'd lock the door behind us, maybe take care of our brothers and sisters, make some snacks, watch some Gilligan's Island reruns or G.I. Joe or whatever. And we basically raised ourselves until our parents got home later that night.
True.
But that didn't stick. They knew as we grew older that we had to be called something else. So for a little while, they started calling us Gen 13 or the 13th generation. And that's because we are the 13th generation in American history, dating back to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And they saw that we were on track to be the unluckiest generation in their mind, that there would be less of us, that we would have less money, that our parents would probably hold on to power so long that we wouldn't be able to attain power ourselves, and everything would just go on to the next generation. Basically, that we'd be skipped. So they called us 13 Gen, unlucky 13. But then that went away, and they started calling us something that really was on the pathway to be what you would know us as if Gen X hadn't come along as a term. They called us the baby busters. So our parents were the baby boomers. That's because the GIs came home from war in the 40s, and they got a ton of women pregnant, and there were more babies than had ever been born in American history there for about 10 years. But and they called them the boomers because the baby boom. But the boomers didn't have babies at the rate that the builders of the Great Generation had. So there were less of us than our parents' generation, which is super rare. And they started just saying, well, if they're a boom, if the boomers are a boom, then this generation's a bust. They're just nothing. They're just not going to even be cared about or talked about.
True.
But then Gen X came along. So it was popularized by a Canadian novelist named Douglas Coupland, who wrote a novel called Generation X, kind of about the angst of this generation. And he stole or borrowed or co-opted the term from a man named Paul Fussell, who wrote a book called Class that was like a critique of the American economic system through the years. The very last chapter of Paul Fussell's book, Class, is called Category X. That's the name of the last chapter. And Fussell writes about this subculture that he's noticing among younger people. He wasn't saying it was a whole generation. He's just noticed that there was a group of people that he didn't know what to label, so he called them X, like a placeholder, to just say, I'm not sure what they are, but they are bohemian typically. They sort of are more attracted to truth-telling and community and maybe just being a little like out there or different. They're not as tied into the rat race or the hamster wheel of trying to get money or success.
True.
So he called them Category X, and Coupland borrowed it as Generation X and wrote a novel about 3 Gen X folks that were trying to live their lives. Coupland also wrote some magazine articles and other things that caught on. So there's various reasons why beyond that Gen X became popular, but from that moment, really, the book came out in 91, the Generation X book, and the Class book came out in 83. So Coupland was a big fan of Paul Fussell, and that's how he got to Generation X, and that's why we're called that. And I think why it stuck is the X kind of went away from meaning unknown towards meaning the same thing that 13 or Buster meant, which was like an X, like, like no luck here, like you're out.
True.
And that's why we're called that, and we're going to change it.
True.